Ladies and gentlemen, while most eyes have been focused on the drama unfolding between the United States and China over trade deals, global supply chains, and geopolitical tensions, few are paying attention to an under-the-radar catastrophe brewing in the Pacific. And don't kid yourself, when I say catastrophe, I mean the type that sends shockwaves across both the economy and national security. What happened on the picturesque island of Guam is a warning siren. It's a microcosm of the larger social, economic and security deterioration issues that illustrate just how vulnerable our infrastructures are, not only to cyber attacks but to government indifference, insufficient regulation, and underfunded institutions. The U.S. military's largest Pacific base is sitting vulnerable to cyber attacks launched from halfway around the globe. But more crucially, the people who are defending the base, managing the systems, and maintaining critical civilian infrastructure seem to be as ill-prepared as they are underfinanced. If the Volt Typhoon hacking storyline, which we first saw surface in 2022, tells us anything, it's that the battle of the future won't be fought with bullets and bombs. It will be fought in the shadows of cyberspace, attacking countries where they are weakest. Let's break down what's at stake, shall we? Most of you might know Guam as a lovely tropical paradise, luring almost 600,000 tourists annually, mostly from South Korea, Japan, and occasionally the US mainland. No massive economy here, right? Well, Guam's island economy hinges predominantly on tourism and the rotational influx of military personnel working on behalf of the U.S., given that 1/3 of the island is occupied by military facilities. But whether we're talking tourists or the world's largest military apparatus, one fact remains: Guam fuels its economy with dollars that flow directly from the global balance of military power. The Guam Power Authority, GPA, already a fragile enterprise, powers it all, providing energy to not only thousands of civilians but to American military personnel occupying the sprawling reserves. Then comes the troubling news. In 2022, intelligence agents began looking closer at GPA's cybersecurity. Hackers, most likely from China, as the US has vehemently claimed, had successfully penetrated local utilities and began what the cyber sleuths refer to as living off the land, quietly sitting inside Guam's energy grid and other infrastructure networks, browsing around and enjoying network traffic like tourists on a tropical vacation. What China is doing here is clear: it's preparing the ground for future warfare through cyber warfare. What's crucial? This isn't simply a security issue, it's a major economic problem. Cyber attacks on utilities can bring an island nation's economy to its knees. If Volt Typhoon or any other hacker initiative takes out Guam's power systems even temporarily, it's not just the military that's in trouble. The $649 million tourism industry is at risk of grinding to a halt, and whereas mainland states can weather such blows, an isolated island territory is exponentially more vulnerable to the fallout. It's the ultimate paradox: a place so small, so distant, yet so strategically pivotal for the US, China, and the global economy at large. An escalating cybersecurity crisis with hostile geopolitical undertones isn't just bad luck. It's the culmination of failure on multiple fronts, starting from the bottom of the federal hierarchy to the island's local governance. When we dive deeper into cases like that of Melvin Kwek, who helmed cybersecurity at Guam Power Authority, everything starts becoming more apparent. And you don't need an economics PhD to understand it. When U.S. federal agents began knocking on Kwek's door for cybersecurity insights on Guam's power systems, even he wasn't sure whether his 4-person cybersecurity team could handle the magnitude of the challenge. Guam, to put it mildly, was flying blind against the threat of Chinese hackers. Lest we forget, we're talking about the island responsible for indirectly fueling military and civilian facilities alike. Is 4 under-resourced security personnel really the best we can muster? Guam's highly localized public goods and infrastructure are woefully inadequate to handle the high-tech threats bearing down on them. These small-scale institutions don't have the capability, nor the guidance, to truly protect the backbone of the island's economic generator. The even larger parallel here to mainland America should be obvious: any state or local utility across the country could be caught in the same scenario. Guam is just the canary in the coal mine. Cybersecurity experts and officials argue that while big initiatives like CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and U.S. Cyber Command have expanded their capabilities substantially in the past decade, they often seem detached from locally managed infrastructure like GPA. As of 2024, the Republican leadership has established a priority around heightened critical infrastructure regulation. Still, we know what history tells us: many politicians are still averse to mandating regulatory burdens, even when they're necessary. Are we really so sure the next administration can shoulder the burden? On top of that, is anyone willing to foot the bill for those upgrades? Let's discuss the economic implications of this situation. Look, it's not just about cybersecurity mismanagement. The real issue here is how the lack of strong government oversight creates massive vulnerabilities that can spiral into economic catastrophe. Let's not downplay this: China doesn't need to invade Taiwan with boots on the ground. Not when they can shut down Guam's grid through cyber attacks, leaving both civilians and the military scrambling. Financial markets thrive on security, and nothing sends stocks spiraling downward faster than geopolitical instability on such strategic footholds. Consider this scenario: by 2024, the U.S. Pentagon alone was spending a whopping $12 billion annually to shore up Pacific military bases like the ones in Guam, as plans for countering China's aggressive posturing intensified. At the same time, cyber attacks like Volt Typhoon pose economic risks that can't be ignored, not just to the U.S. military but to investors, businesses, and entire sectors that depend on Guam's critical infrastructure. This is where economists sniff out the cold, hard truth: if businesses, especially vital ones like infrastructure, tech utilities, or logistics providers, continue to rely on inadequately protected systems, the cost of disruption becomes an enormous drain on GDP growth. The economic hit in Guam's case could quadruple if cross-island infrastructure collapses. Take the stock markets as an indicator. In times of geopolitical upheaval, especially when triggered by economic disruptions like infrastructure damage or stalled military readiness, we see sudden drops in market valuation. Downgrades in GDP predictions tend to follow global military conflicts, or at least expectations of conflicts, as seen when China's disputes over Taiwan in 2023 shook global markets with even the discussion of U.S. intervention. Every hacked system, every vulnerability posed makes investors leery. A deeper question emerges: what's the social cost of letting Guam deal with such critical failures? It's easy to dismiss this as just a problem for military brass, but the locals, the residents of Guam, need to factor into the equation. In 2016, roughly 25% of the population in Guam lived below the poverty line, and while tourism props up the island's economy, the average resident relies far less on tourist dollars and far more on public infrastructure, which, by the way, is precisely what's being breached by intrusions like Volt Typhoon. When utilities fail, the worst hit won't be the tourists lounging in five-star resorts but the local residents watching food prices spike, transportation shut down, and businesses fold as power grids melt in a cyberstorm. Social panic? Absolutely. Unemployment? Without a doubt. Socioeconomic unrest? A ticking time bomb. This is part of the broader economic lesson. Remember, the ripple effects of underprepared local governments and civil services aren't born in isolation. When the infrastructure buckles, accelerated by cyber attacks or natural shocks, everyday citizens will shoulder the burden through higher prices, compressed wages, and reduced access to basic resources. The U.S. has been outspent and outmaneuvered in cyber warfare preparation for years. While the U.S. devotes around $15 billion a year to cybersecurity, experts have pointed out that China and Russia have been innovating faster, with cheaper solutions, while focusing on vulnerabilities in places like Guam, where strategic assets are ripe to be hacked. Think back to the 2023 Treasury Department hack, another cyber fiasco pinned on Chinese hacking groups, or the ongoing Salt Typhoon campaign that targeted U.S. telecom firms and politicians' personal phones during the 2024 election cycle. These incidents demonstrate that the U.S.'s approach to cyber defense has been largely reactive, a horrible strategical error when the enemy has already breached the gates. In conclusion, what happened on Guam should frighten every one of us, not just as a security threat but, critically, as an economic catastrophe waiting to happen. The Volt Typhoon crisis wasn't just some minor breach of local infrastructure. No, this was a shot across the bow signaling how the next war will unfold, quietly and destructively, targeting the beating heart of the economy: infrastructure, private companies, public institutions, all interconnected in an economy increasingly dependent on digital connectivity. The U.S. hasn't just mismanaged cyber defense, it's left its own economy open to collapse. And the sad truth is, it's far from alone. With Chinese hackers perfecting the art of stealth, using tactics specific to each critical piece of infrastructure, no corner of the economy is safe. So let's be honest, what's really at stake here isn't just power grids in Guam, it's the entire economic foundation that props up local communities, national defense, and quite frankly, the global economy. If protection doesn't come soon, we're looking at a future where the biggest risk isn't runaway inflation, stock crashes, or unemployment, it's the complete cyber destruction of the infrastructure that keeps everything running.